I think we can get started. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce a friend and colleague as our Grand Round speaker, and that's Dr. Mark Gilbert. Dr. Gilbert is a board-certified psychiatrist and a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, and he also serves as an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry in our department. He is the director of the Mind-Body Medicine Skills Group program at the Arizona Health Sciences Center, and also is one of the 2 psychiatrists that works at the Arizona Cancer Center. Dr. Gilbert founded and co-directed one of the first integrative medical clinics in Canada for over a decade, and that was the Mind-Body Medicine Canada and the Integrated Pain Treatment Center. He also has run Mind-Body Medicine Skills Group programs for patients with chronic life-threatening illnesses, and also run similar groups for residents, medical students, and faculty for the past 15 years. A graduate of the University of California, Dr. Gilbert has run mind-body medicine groups as far back as the Norman Cousins era at UCLA through the 1970s, and he also there taught family therapy for an integrative approach, and also did something similar to that at the University of Toronto. He presently teaches these principles to first-year medical students at our college and also to psychiatry residents and psychology interns in our department. And this afternoon his talk is entitled "To Keep on Trying to Climb Your Own Mountain, the Psychoneuroimmunology of Resilience, Optimism, and Hope." And I should also add that Dr. Gilbert has nothing to disclose that would indicate a conflict of interest with today's presentation. Dr. Gilbert.
Thanks, Dr. Mishashik. So, you're here to listen to a talk today on a subject that goes into the scientific body of this subspecialty that I'm very much in love with, which is mind-body medicine. And this talk is a little bit over, you're going to be listening for about an hour and 10 minutes. So I'm going to have you stretch in the middle of the talk for a few minutes because it's a long and it's a ton of scientific detail in the middle of some other stuff, okay? So I'm going to get going here. We're talking about, in particular, resilience. Optimism is a basic tenet of being resilient, and hope is something different. We're going to find out all about that and what that is. Resilience has all sorts of different branches. National resilience is one of those, and an example of that is shown here. So for those of you, okay. So, resilience. Many years ago, I listened to an interview. There are a number of centenarians, a locus of centenarians, people who live to 100 years or more in this country. The largest number of centenarians in the world live in Okinawa, Japan. But the locus of centenarians in our country are up in Massachusetts, most of them. Why, we don't know, in the northwestern part of Massachusetts. And one of these women was interviewed. She was 103 years of age. She was just coming out of her aerobics class. She had a big smile on her face. She was bouncing her great-granddaughter on her knee. And she has been through probably as many traumas as all of us traumatized together in this room have been through in her own life. And there she is, okay, smiling away. And of course, they asked her the quintessential question. So, how did you do it? And she looked in the camera and she said, well, it was simple. She said, resilience, resilience. I'm like an Indian rubber ball. The harder I hit the concrete, the higher I bounce. The harder I hit the concrete, the higher I bounce. So, the last example here, before we talk about what this whole word resilience means within our physiology, is about Resilient Sam. I'm going to show you, and I'm going to read to you a speech over 5 slides here of Resilient Sam. Resilient Sam is Sam Filer, Sam Filer was a relative of mine, but very indirectly. He was married to my uncle's wife. He's my uncle's wife's brother, or was my uncle's wife's brother. So he's an in-law and then brother of that woman. Sam Filer was a Superior Court judge in Canada. He was in Saskatchewan and then moved to Toronto. And he has something he's known for in Canada that's quite famous. He was the longest lived person in Canada with Lou Gehrig's disease. He had Lou Gehrig's for 23 years. And he died about a year and a half ago. He died in a house fire. His wife, who was basically a saint to him through all of his illness, she was pregnant with their only child when he was diagnosed. And she had left the house for a short period of time, and there was an electric heater on in the house. She went to get some food for him, and the electric heater started on fire, and the house burned down. 23 years. He was going in, till 2 years ago, he was going into court. He had a computer, a microprocessor, in each of his cheeks and in his hard palate, so that he was still making court decisions from his wheelchair by pressing yes on the left, no on the right. He had a double press for some other answers, and on the hard palate, he passed it on to another judge. So he gave a speech about 10 or 11 years into his illness, and this is it. In determining an appropriate, he gave a speech with the help of his wife. In determining an appropriate title for these remarks, I suggest if you want good strawberries, you also need lots of manure. The sunshine which is a given represents the light that comes with knowledge and understanding, and the challenge of achieving a rich and satisfying life. The manure is, of course, the price you pay in physical, emotional, and financial terms for getting there. My wife, on the other hand, suggested the title, "A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Sam's Eulogy," indicating that despite all prognoses to the contrary, life holds unexpected and enjoyable pleasures, chief among which is the fact that I am now 8 years beyond my death due date and continue figuratively to thumb my nose at the moribund statistics surrounding Lou Gehrig's disease. After much discussion, we compromised with the title, "Who's the Judge?" Throughout my 9-year visitation with ALS, I have learned that it is possible to continue to live a life of quality and to share that quality with and from our devoted family and friends whose love is a constant source of joy and strength for us. People with disabilities and chronic illness do not seek handouts, nor do they consciously search out charity. I earned my right to continue sitting as a judge despite my disability, to continue to utilize fully the one major faculty remaining to me, my mind. I am unquestionably restricted in the physical manifestations of my daily life, but I would consider it an insult to my dignity to have my intellectual abilities challenged by judging me on the basis of my physical limitations. I believe very strongly in the principle of self-determination, which is the normal respect to which an individual is entitled. It involves asserting oneself in regard to choices, wishes, desires, and aspirations, and participating in decisions involving one's own interest. These decisions can only be made on the basis of information gleaned. When it comes to determine quality of life, the criteria are so subjective that it's easier to agree on what it's not. In my case, it's likely that my condition and the limitations it imposes on me would be found on most lists of the 10 top things that make for a life lacking in quality. Let me assure you, I am not confined to a wheelchair, I am mobilized by one. I am not ventilator dependent. I am a happy consumer of a lung-expanding, breath-giving device which allows me to continue doing the things I love. It has given me and us a degree of independence and a second chance at life that we would otherwise not have had. The doctors told me that ALS is a virtual death sentence, but I am not dying from a life-threatening disease. I am living with a life-enhancing condition. Far from rendering me disabled, the ventilator, the wheelchair, the computer have empowered me to a level of ability not previously considered, given the constraints imposed by ALS. They allow me to maximize my abilities rather than focus on my disabilities. Quantitatively and objectively, to come full circle, the manure of my projected title appears to outweigh the sunshine. But when you evaluate our lives qualitatively, there is no contest. To quote a very dear friend of ours, my wife continues to be supported in ways less tangible but far more powerful than the pumping of a machine. My life. In closing, I leave you with a thought that has become my personal credo. There are those who would sit and curse the darkness rather than light a candle. I thank all those who help me light the candle and keep it lit. By your mere presence here today, by your involvement in such a crucial and worthwhile enterprise, and by your willingness to learn, you are evidencing your own commitment to lighting the candle for yourselves and on behalf of so many others. I find this actually quite touching in a simplistic way, because in the mind-body medicine skills groups we run, we have a candle in the center of our group as a means of focusing on the candle and on the light, not on the darkness. So, what causes somebody to perceive in such a way and live in such a way? So we're now going to go on a whirlwind ride on these three topics, and we're going to start with resilience because that's the biggie. But we're going to look at how they're separate first. Resilience refers to the ability to successfully adapt to stressors, to bounce back from setbacks, and maintain psychological well-being in the face of adversity. Optimism is the expectation of a positive outcome. Very often, again, a tenet in resilience research. And hope is a future-oriented perspective involving the positive expectation for meaning attached to life events. It's not the positive expectation of an outcome, a positive outcome, it's the positive expectation for meaning, and there's quite a difference there. So let's look at resilience first. The everyday meaning of the word resilience extends to anything that bounces back. Estee Lauder makes resilience lift eye cream. Hanes makes resilience pantyhose. In psychology, it's the word for springing back from serious adversity, like abuse, war, illness, or natural disasters. Confucius said, "Our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall." Hemingway ironically said, "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards some are strong at the broken places." The dictionary definition of resilience is from the Latin verb resilire, which means to jump back or recoil. So the capacity of a strained body to recover its size and shape after deformation, especially caused when it's compressed stress, and or an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. He appears to have lost all of his resilience. This is Rubber Man. He's kind of not doing it. Jim Gordon said that resilience is the ability to thrive, mature, and increase competence in the face of adverse circumstances. There are biological triggers for this, environmental. It can be chronic or infrequent, and a person depends on all of their resources, biological, psychological, and environmental. We're going to see that, absolutely you're going to see that through the research. Resilience is an interactive concept, said Michael Rudder, who is the expert on resilience in children in Great Britain, has been for decades. It's an interactive concept that refers to relative resistance to environmental risk experiences or the overcoming of stress or adversity. And he emphasizes here about the individual variations in response to comparable experiences. And those individual variations are based on a whole number of things that are put into, as you'll see, context. Resilience is an inference that a person is doing okay, that there is now or has been a significant risk to overcome, and it is not a diagnosis, but in fact it's a way of being. With children, Maston and Garmetzi have found protective factors from non-independent stress, cognitive abilities, self-efficacy or mastery, feeling of control of life, temperament, self-regulation, hopefulness, faith, as well as parenting quality, bonding with competent adults, connection to pro-social peers, good schools, connection to pro-social community networks, neighborhood quality, and the quality of social services and health care, which all makes somewhat sense. Hagelin, the top researcher in this field here in the United States, says that it's multi-determined. It's like a polygenic kind of determinant, which is there's neurobiology, psychological profile, personal traumas, peritraumatic circumstances, all causing stress, and then you use moral compass, social support, positive emotions, active coping, cognitive flexibility, exercise and art, etc., to buffer the stress, but that's not exactly the whole story. There is a piece here that's genetic. And as those of you who were here at Ground Rounds last week heard, there is this issue about the two long alleles, 5-HTT serotonin transporter alleles, that seem to provide protection. And this large study on New Zealand adults showed this. It provides protection in having those two long 5-HTT alleles from depressed mood and traumatic repercussions of environmental stress in about a third of the population, but only if the stress has occurred. So there's an expression that comes out, a gene expression under stress. Motherless peer-raised rhesus monkeys with these two long alleles are more likely to take the presence of a stranger in stride, as mother-raised monkeys do, and unlike the short allele group. Again, in terms of genetics crossed with environment, resilience, Rudder said, cannot be seen as a fixed attribute, therefore. Okay, because we have all these different complex mechanisms involved both in genetics and in the environment. Here is the representation of these two 5-HTT long alleles that some of us are lucky to have. I don't know about myself, but some of you. And this is an important piece. So in this study by Kaufman on abused children, those with two long alleles had resilience, but a strong adult bond with someone else ameliorated the short allele makeup. So you don't have to have them. It can be made up for. So that's good news. So now we're going to go on this ride for the next 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, on the psychoneuroendocrine immunology of resilience. So hang in there. So I call this the tree on this mountain we're building on Resilience Mountain, and we're going to start with this leaf, which is the two long 5-HTT alleles, right? Now, how many factors are involved in what determines resilience in PNEI? Well, at least 22. And we're going to touch a little bit on every one of them right now. The first leaf is DHEA and cortisol. They have a very complex relationship with resilience. Cortisol, introducing cortisol, and two glucocorticoid receptor variants, N636 and BC11. Well, you know, when you start doing research in this, you come up with all sorts of discoveries that only perhaps people like Dr. Marino know about. It's just amazing the complexity of the human body as we find out more and more all the time. Prenatal maternal stress is linked to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal increased activity in offspring and into the infant's adulthood in those kids who have this variant. So you have this variant, then prenatal maternal stress is going to determine something into your adulthood. Depressed patients have higher cortisol levels. We know that generally. PTSD patients seem to have lower cortisol levels, and they're more sensitive to the HPA axis GRs. Okay? It's going to get a little complicated here. Anti-glucocorticoid and anti-glutamatergic activities are found for DHEA in the brain. It facilitates learning and memory. It enhances cognition and performance under stress. DHEA cortisol ratios may show how one is buffered against stress. So that's been found in performance in soldiers, that a higher ratio occurs in the best performing soldiers. Also in recovery from PTSD, it's facilitated by high levels of DHEA. Depressed patients seem to have less. So here was a study on resilience among maltreated and non-maltreated low-income children, 700 almost of them. They looked at cortisol and DHEA with respect to ego resiliency and ego control. Now, here's a complicated issue. They found that lower morning cortisol was related to higher resilient functioning, but only in non-maltreated children. But in contrast, among the physically abused children, high morning cortisol was related to high resilient functioning. Okay, we don't have a full understanding of this yet. Maltreated children with high resilience showed an atypical rise in DHEA from morning to the afternoon. Right? So they had more of that sort of softening effect. Morning and afternoon DHEA cortisol ratios were positively related to resilient functioning, that is, higher ratios, but did not interact with maltreatment status. So ego resilience, Circetti and Rogosh said, strongly differentiated maltreated and non-maltreated children, and cortisol and DHEA maintained independent contributions in predicting resilience among high-risk youth. Number 2, HbA1c. So we're going to look at, you're going to see how far we've gotten along here by our numbers. Number 2, HbA1c, diabetes. Okay, in this study we have 111 patients with diabetes. Resilience was defined as such, a factor score of self-esteem, self-efficacy, self-mastery, and optimism. And what they found was baseline resilience, diabetes-related distress, and their interaction predicted physical health a year out. Okay? Resilience predicted future HbA1c status and buffered worsening HbA1c and self-care behaviors in the face of high distress levels. Positive attitude. Yep, seems to have some effect. Here we have a really big study that was done last year in Australia. 10,000 Australians studied over 3 years. Happiness and the ability to cope, which they defined as being resilience, and life satisfaction at the baseline survey were both associated with excellent, good, or very good health, but most importantly here, a significant higher level of physical health 3 years later. So there's some kind of effect. Number 4, hardiness. Most of you have heard this word. Susanna Cabasa did her research on CEOs way back many years ago and looking at what the CEOs who were most resilient actually had in common, and they had this hardiness component that they had. They were committed, they were able to take on a challenge, they in fact enjoyed challenges, and they felt a sense of self-efficacy or control. So here we have a study of 9,500 elderly Australian women aged 73 to 78, a couple of years ago, on optimism and health-related hardiness. And they looked at symptom scales. And the data showed, although cross-sectional, they suggested that positive personal characteristics may well contribute to well-being. When inoculating individuals without other stressors with infectious agents, the high hardy group has a larger mean proliferative response than the low hardy group. Here's an interesting, kind of weird one. Urinary incontinence in women. Lower psychological resilience, Jameson found, scores are significantly associated with urinary incontinence in women of all age groups. And the significant correlates in women from 25 to 39 years where hysterectomy, weak core abdominal muscles, and lack of psychological resilience. Positive emotional granularity, number 5. Trait-resilient people may understand the benefits associated with positive emotions. And we talk about positive emotional granularity here. The term means the tendency to represent positive emotional experiences with precision and specificity. It's not just I'm feeling better. They're able to well represent why they're feeling better and the different quality of it. Dr. Lane in our own department has, as most of you know, shown that people with more sophisticated development of emotional processing have more integration and desomatization of emotional experiences. These individuals seem to have a more stable sense of well-being, better social support, better impulse control, and likely, as he's told me, are more resilient to stress. A higher cortical-subcortical loop, he says, seems to be created for this sophistication, in particular, pulling in the dorsal ACC and medial prefrontal cortex, therefore modifying the amygdala response. So that's in granulation. Number 6, those who have quick switch thinking. Quick. Related to dopamine, apparently. Cognitive effects of positive emotions are linked to increased dopamine levels and the ability to switch cognitive set quickly. In trait-resilient individuals, the experience of positive emotions related to accelerated speed and rebounding from cardiovascular activation generated by negative emotions, such as less heart rate variability. Number 7, mediating the fear response. So Haglund, in his studies on rats, used behavioral immunization. He found that he could actually have the rat become more resilient, and he found that this occurred in rats in the medial prefrontal cortex, and the serotonergic neurons of the dorsiraphe nucleus mediated the fear response in them. We know there's substantial plasticity involved in neural circuitry at birth, particularly in the CRH, corticotropin release hormone, and in hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis circuitry. In fact, it looks like there may be a critical postnatal period in the first few weeks of life during which post-traumatic experiences are particularly disruptive development in these systems. Women abused as children have increased HP axis and autonomic activity in response to stress compared to control groups. Women with severe and prolonged physical abuse in childhood have smaller hippocampal volumes in general. All right, number 8, stress inoculation. Exposure at a young age to mild or manageable forms of stress builds a more resilient neurobiological profile. That is stress inoculation. Children who overcome moderately stressful events, are better equipped to deal with stressors later in life and seem to be more resilient. So moderate stress is helpful. Severe stress is not. A study by Boyce showing that male teens survive severely stressful life events as children have decreased blood pressure and heart rate reactivity during challenging tasks. In monkey studies, acute distress during brief, manageable separations from mom, like an hour per week, cause lower anxiety and lower basal stress hormone later in life. A leading candidate who represents a true model of resilience for the world is this being, some of you may know. And we're just going to take a break to see an example of resilience here. Fortunately, Wiley has the 2 long 5-HTT alleles and good parenting. Sorry, Wiley. Okay, so number 9, the CRH pathway. So, there are neurohormonal factors here. The CRH cortical neuronal activation decreases expectation of rewards, it's found in animal studies. Excess stress in childhood can lead to excess CRH activity in the adult brain. Okay? CRH1 receptors, they have anxiogenic response. CRH2 has anxiolytic roles. So resilient patients seem to have the capacity to regulate their CRH levels and the balance of CRH1 and CRH2 receptor subtypes. You really should give me a little credit. Not many men could cope with failure the way I have. I don't know if we'll count him as a result. Testosterone, number 10. Testosterone, bless you, does have an effect on resilience. Here is, there's actually a hockey study. It's recruited. Dr. Mishashik wants it on the record that he beat the pants off the other team. Thank you. It's the Montreal Canadiens. That's quite something, considering the Leafs are second last. So testosterone. Okay, so aggressiveness, social status, and personal experience of success are associated in research studies with this hormone, and with social connectedness, with teammates, okay, male and female. Hockey athletes, in fact, there was a study on hockey athletes and testosterone, had more self-confidence, less anxiety, and they were more likely to win with higher levels of testosterone. They're more likely to approach a dominant challenge and have decreased aversion to threatening stimuli. Now, what does psychological stress do? It tends to decrease testosterone levels. That's been found in soldiers and in marathon runners. CRH may, in fact, interfere directly with Leydig cell function. That may be one of the reasons. Testosterone may be reduced in depression and in PTSD, but there's no real good evidence across the research to show that yet. Locus coeruleus and norepinephrine and COMT, number 11. Okay, well, stress activates the locus coeruleus. We know that, that's for sure. More norepinephrine, right? High levels of LC norepinephrine inhibit the prefrontal cortex, and instinctual responses come to the surface more. Here's COMT. Persistent hyperfunctioning, LC norepinephrine's response, if there's severe stress in childhood, cause chronic anxiety, fear, intrusive memories, increased cardiovascular disease and blood pressure, perhaps PTSD, depression, and panic. If low-functioning COMT, they have more vigilant attention and working memory and more fear and lower emotional resilience against negative mood. NPY, I hadn't heard of this one. Neuropeptide Y counteracts the anxiogenic effects of CRH. Okay? The balance of NPY and CRH seems to be crucial in maintaining a homeostatic emotional state. And in fact, PTSD patients have lower NPY. Elevated NPY show better performance under stress. 14, galanin. Galanin 1 and galanin 3. Galanin 1 has anti-anxiety effects on the amygdala, hypothalamus, and stria terminalis. Galanin 3 appears to be anxiogenic. So galanin inhibits serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine in these cases. Laboratory research studies have now proven how mice are best able to achieve resilience. Serotonin, number 15. We're almost there. 5-HT1A receptors are anxiolytic and may be linked to adaptive responses to aversive events. 5-HT2A receptors are anxiogenic. Inappropriate generalization of fearful behaviors occur when these receptors are triggered more, like in panic, phobias, or PTSD. So we know genetic loading for 5-HT1A receptor density. Well, early life stress may increase CRH and cortisol in these people, down-regulating 5-HT1A. Patients with short alleles that we talked about before to the 5-HTT receptor transporter gene, show increased amygdala activity and fear and more PTSD. Number 16, the dopamine reward system. Those whose genetic profile has excess mesocortical dopamine release after stressful events may have more vulnerability to stress. PTSD, decreased prefrontal dopamine circulation. Number 17, neural reward circuitry. Resilient people may have hypersensitivity to reward or resistance to change. Anticipation of reward involves mesolimbic dopamine paths. Dopamine fires up when rewards are expected. How many more things on this resilience list? I can't take this anymore, dude. Okay, shh, be quiet, Lisa. Orbital cortices from the nucleus accumbens input discriminate value of rewarding stimuli. So we have the medial prefrontal cortex involved in the likelihood of receiving a reward, and the anterior insula has aversion to risks in reward pursuit. So when we look at all this, it's becoming, like, obviously incredibly complex when you say, oh, that person's resilient. Well, what are we talking about here? What is the balance of all these environmental and physiological factors that brings that person to that moment? Last few. So here we have the nucleus accumbens and CAMP response, elementary binding protein, which may decrease reward pursuit in the nucleus accumbens or in the amygdala. Stable reward circuitry increases an individual's resilience here. In rodents, knocking out something called brain-derived neurotropic factor, BDNF, in the mesolimbic dopamine system led to a reward system that had lost its plasticity and was resistant to change under stress. We don't know if this mimics human beings. Number 20, fear learning and resistance to stress. Resilient individuals facilitate extinction of fearful memories. PTSD patients overgeneralize fear cues, having been reminded of past traumas by many environmental stimuli. The lateral amygdala likely stores fear memory storage and acquisition. But the long loop relay to the amygdala goes through cortical regions, where we have a chance to ameliorate some of those responses. So there's higher level processing there. Number 21, last of two, the actin polymerization protein in the lateral amygdala lays down fear conditioning. Fear learning may be blocked by NMDA receptor blockers, and that's been shown in soldiers knowing that they are entering battle. Resilient individuals may have potent medial prefrontal cortex inhibition of amygdala responsiveness. So individuals who attenuate learned fear through extinction are likely highly stress resilient. Phew. Okay, so those are the factors known thus far that we've covered on what contributes to resilience. Now we have a nice little video that I'd like you to watch on a clinical example of resilience.
There's no telling the heights a person will rise to if she puts her mind to it, particularly if she has an entire class of school kids cheering her on. This morning, Seth Doan has such a story.
We get hundreds and hundreds of letters every week here at Sunday Morning, but this one really stuck out. It's written very carefully by a girl named Lisa Herrera. It starts, "I'm a fourth grade student at the Donald McKay Elementary School in East Boston, Massachusetts. I want to tell you about an interesting lady whose name is Wendy Booker."
Hi, guys. I love when Wendy comes to our classroom because she shows us amazing things and tells us about her life. I think if you put her on your show, people will love her because Wendy inspired me and she can inspire other people.
I brought everything.
This is the story of one woman, about 60 kids, and 7 mountains.
So we'll start. Are you taking notes?
It all began 2 years ago when Wendy Booker first met the kids in Jim Clear's 4th grade class.
And I thought it would just be one time that I visit a classroom. I've done that many times, other schools, other classrooms, Girl Scouts, everything, till I got there. And these children are incredible. I've never met a class of kids like this.
Then again, they had never met anyone quite like her.
And again, there will be 2 more layers, and I'll show you in a second.
How do you like Wendy?
She's nice.
Suck it in there, boy.
She treats us like a friend.
Have you ever had that before?
No.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Wendy Booker is a woman on a mission. She's decided to climb the highest mountain on every continent on Earth. A tall order, but Wendy is used to taking on challenges, though they're usually not documented by a class of 10-year-olds.
I get as much out of these kids who are counting on you, looking up to you, and cheering you on. You know the proverbial expression, it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to get Wendy up a mountain.
There was Mount McKinley, also called Denali, in 2004, Kilimanjaro in 2005, Elbrus in 2006, and last year, with the class's help, Wendy summited Aconcagua in Argentina. We caught up with Wendy and the kids at McKay Elementary a few months ago, not long after we received Lisa Herrera's letter.
Okay, so that's the flag I'm going to take to the top because this top belongs to what? All of us.
It was just before Wendy was off to the South Pole to attempt to summit Vinson, the highest peak in Antarctica.
I've been cold since I've been in Boston for 2 days, so when I get to Antarctica, I don't want to be cold.
But as fierce as the cold can be, Wendy faces a far greater challenge. Wendy has multiple sclerosis.
And it's different in everybody, and it's unpredictable, which is a difficult part, because right now I'm doing very well, and the hope is, by staying on my daily medication, to stay like I am. But it's an unknown.
She was diagnosed 10 years ago when she was 44.
She was kind of sad. She thought she was going to be in a wheelchair. I felt sad if she was.
I thought I better start living life really fast and really full before I get into that wheelchair.
Which is why 8 years ago she challenged herself to run the Boston Marathon.
I used to think about MS every step of the way. I was so focused on, oh, I'm going to fall or I'm going to get too tired. Then I started realizing that, wow, I just ran a quarter of a mile and I didn't think about my illness.
So she decided to set her sights even higher. In 2002, she tried to climb Mount McKinley.
Oh, McKinley is really what it's like to have multiple sclerosis. It's hard, it's steep, it's scary. We don't always get to the top. We have to do things more than once.
But she failed the first time. 2 years later, she made it.
And I thought, what a good way to show the world what people with MS are facing every single day.
All of this was a big change from her life before MS.
I wasn't a runner. I wasn't particularly athletic. I took jazzercise and I was an interior decorator.
Got the water bottle, we're ready to go.
But Wendy's mission had become so important that she decided to leave her home in Boston and move to Boulder, Colorado, to train at altitude for more taxing climbs
I
ahead.
decided if I really was going to be serious, and Everest is in my near future now, I had to really work at it.
4,
She works out almost every day.
1, and relax. Good.
And that's the easy part. The MS makes even simple movements much more difficult. Wendy has to compensate for impaired balance and a partially numb left side.
So I have to concentrate, which is why I'm not looking at you.
What do you mean? What do you have to concentrate on?
I really have to think it through before I do it.
Hello, Wendy.
Through it all, Wendy says, Mr. Clear's 4th grade class is there for her.
We may have to turn back because we're way out.
She checked in via satellite phone from Antarctica when blizzard conditions made reaching the top of Vinson, at least on that day, beyond her grasp.
Keep thinking of Wendy. We'll keep our fingers crossed.
What does she teach you? What do you come away with?
Everybody can achieve their goal and don't give up on it.
What was it with this diagnosis that made you decide to go out there, set these goals, and do something and not give up? Was part of it fear?
Yes, there definitely was that. You can't catch me, MS. Now, I think there's a lot of benefit to be gained by being physically and mentally active, that I don't have time right now to wallow in my illness.
As for the 4th graders back in Boston, they've gotten a great geography lesson.
So here's a picture of Mount Vinson. Looks pretty cold up there.
They've learned a little math.
If Camp 2 was 8,700 feet, how many meters is that?
And they've learned something else besides.
I want to be a veterinarian. Veterinarian and mountain climbing don't have nothing in common. But from Wendy, I learned that you have to keep on trying. You have to climb your own mountain.
I'm walking like I'm drunk.
On her 2nd attempt to summit Vinson, Wendy made it to the top, along with that flag with every student's signature. A reminder that though they may never encounter the barriers Wendy Booker faces, no obstacle is insurmountable.
We're on the top. We did it.
And if once you fail, try again.
We're safe, we're sound, and we're heading down.
Everybody, 30-second stretch, please. Stand up. Important to be resilient for this talk. So 30 seconds, stretch. Come on, stretch it all out. Yeah. Breathe out all of the tension of too much information. Okay, all right, let's have a seat and let's look at optimism and hope, but not in the same details as resilience. The contribution of optimism to resilience. Churchill said, "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." So, in this country, Suzanne Segerstrom is the leading researcher in the psychoneuroimmunology of optimism at this present time. And she has shown definitively that optimism is associated with mood, coping, and immune change in response to stress. She showed the first study to show optimism related to enhanced immunity and has replicated that study. Dispositional optimists, she said, have shown less mood disturbance to a number of stressors. I see it as half full. You see it more as half empty. Whatever. Optimists believe that discrepancies between their goals and their current attainment will be resolved. Optimism is associated, we know, with better health in general, as with fewer signs of infarct during CABG procedures and better quality of life after surgery. And situational optimism has helped people with HIV, and they have longer survival times if they're more optimistic. Optimism can result in immune changes through mood changes, through coping, and health behavior, but, there's a big but, optimists have lower immune parameters than pessimists when stressors persist over time or participants experience goal conflicts. This is found not just by Cohen, by Segerstrom as well. So it's kind of interesting because it seems that optimists have like the woodpecker syndrome. I'm going to do it, I can do it, I can do it, we'll get it done, I can do it, it's going to be all right, everything's going to be fine, everything's going to be fine. But if they meet a wall that can't be knocked down, their immune system starts to get a hit, even worse than pessimists, as you're going to see. If they're adaptive, that is, if they have more resilience, and they're able to say, you know what, this wall, I don't think it's a good idea. I'm going to go around this wall, we're going to go after something else. Their immune enhancement is much greater than norm. So, it's not just about being optimistic. With in vitro fertilization failure, breast cancer, cardiac relapses, if prior dispositional optimism, these did not lead to distress, okay, as much as people who didn't have prior dispositional optimism. High dispositional optimism leads to more problem solving and acceptance, less disengagement and denial. And high self-awareness seems to be correlated with increased motivation to improve one's standing, and people who are optimists seem to have more self-awareness, which is kind of interesting. Increased effort in long run may lead to decreased immunity, but this is what I had spoken to you about, but depending on environmental circumstances, in the very long run may be beneficial. And Segerstrom did a study on first-year law students with academic social conflicts. She found that they had poorer immunity in the first year, but better in the second year because there were less academic demands and their optimism came through. Immunity is affected, particularly the study of natural killer cells. We're going to come to that in a moment. But we also know in cardiovascular there's decreased blood pressure, decreased rehospitalization after CABG procedures if you're optimistic. In cancer, there's decreased mortality rates in young head and neck cancers, but for some reason in this study, not in lung cancer patients, only in that particular group of patients. There hasn't been a ton of study on this. HIV, we have a study showing that Afro-American females with HPV had enhanced immunity, but not in gay men. So, not sure what that's about. Maybe there's something that they missed. Prolonged stress over a week, as I said, causes negative effects on immunity in the optimist after an initial positive effect. Young optimistic males exposed to loud noise who had some control had better immunity. If they didn't have control, their immunity was worse. Now, Sieber believed that this woodpecker business and the immune suppression in optimists when they couldn't reach their goal had to do with disappointment. That in fact it was an affective thing. They felt sad and disappointed about this. Segerstrom proved that he was wrong, that it was more the engagement hypothesis, that they don't give up, that they keep at it and keep at it. So there is, again, this need for knowing when to keep at it and when to let go, both. When circumstances are easy or straightforward, Segerstrom said, optimism will be positively related to immunity because engagement can lead to termination of the stressor. But when circumstances are difficult or complex, optimism will be negatively related to immunity because it leads to ongoing engagement with persistent stressors. Optimists are more likely than pessimists to engage difficult tasks, therefore. Engagement is a state here. It's important to note that can have effective correlates like getting excited and getting involved, but is primarily cognitive and motivational engagement. So she has told me by phone that she's just completed another study of first-year law students who moved away from home. And she's found that they have higher immunity with optimism, if they're optimistic, as opposed to the law students who stayed at home for their first year. The law students who were optimistic and stayed at home for first year didn't do as well as the ones who went away. They're wondering about this. All they can gather up is it seems that the ones who stayed at home have more conflict. They want to do it all. So they want to maintain a relationship with the friends they have, plus their university friends, plus whatever, plus they have these academics, plus there's still many of them living at home, or they moved out or whatever. So they have a lot of things going on. By the second year, it seems to get better, but they have to catch up to the people who have gone away. And again, there's note here about delayed hypersensitive skin testing, stronger cell immunity if they left home and were optimistic. Optimistic changes in expectancies also correlate with increases, again, in antibody effect from vaccinations, especially if they have a positive affect. Dispositional optimism at 1 month after discharge for patients with unstable angina and post-MI predict depressive symptoms or not at 1-year follow-up. Dispositional optimism prior to bypass surgery predicts quality of life after 8 months, and optimistic bypass patients report a favorable quality of life at 6 months. Of course, the big guru in this field, the psychologist for decades, on optimism, Seligman, had done the biggest study of all on optimism in Harvard medical student graduates. That's a longitudinal study that's gone on for more than 40 years. And he found significantly they had much less health-related problems if they had a dispositional optimism. Older adults with osteoarthritis, same thing, greater optimism and support were significantly related to both greater life satisfaction and lower depressive symptoms. Partially mediated relationship of pain to life satisfaction. Same with ICD patients in the cardiology clinic, better general health at long-term follow-up if they are optimistic. Older male veterans. In an 8-year follow-up, this is even in respiratory assessment, men more optimistic had higher levels of forced expiratory volume in 1 second and forced vital capacity. Stop being so negative. A real optimist would have said be positive. Pessimistic explanatory styles being found to be associated with lower immunocompetence in elderly men and women pessimists. The brain, it turns out, generates an optimism bias. Human beings tend towards optimism. We expect positive events. We expect that things will turn out somewhat well. And apparently there is a neuroanatomical correlationship with this, with enhanced activation of the right amygdala, which simulates future emotional events, and in the rostral anterior cingulate cortex, which is located, for those of you who want to remember, there. So in this part of the brain, self-reflective tasks, self-referential judgments reflect hopes and dreams, indication of preferences, and judging trustworthiness of others occurs. It's correlated with trait optimism, the more enhanced activity there. And finally, hope, the contribution of hope. Mother Teresa, to keep a lamp burning, we have to keep putting oil in it. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince. A rock pile ceases to be a rock pile the moment a single man contemplates it, bearing within him the image of a cathedral. Hope is a noun, it's a verb, it's an adjective. With cancer, there's a hope of a cure, prolonged survival. In terminal illness, hope is defined as a struggle to come to terms with multiple loss. Hiding or distorting the truth is not hope. Denial is not hope. Engendering hope is best engineered through honesty and empathy by framing hope in a wider context. Here are the hope categories in illness that we find: hope for cure, social support, search for information, spiritual belief, limiting the impact of a trauma, living in the moment. Hope is an experience revealed in a dynamic pattern associated with an individual's life situation. Here is a trial: abandon hope and then resume hope. Hopelessness plays a role in the occurrence of both fatal and non-fatal cardiac disease. It's a strong predictor of adverse outcomes, including cancer and myocardial infarct, independent of depression and traditional risk factors. Men with high levels of hopelessness have much faster progression of carotid atherosclerosis. We know that as a fact now. Men with hopelessness have higher risk of hypertension. Many indirect measures of hope relate to notions of self-efficacy and locus of control. It's an inner force inherent in a person's will to live. Viktor Frankl, who was the most influential teacher certainly by reading in my residency program, said that hope is a process of human becoming through which one searches for meaning for oneself in relationships outside self. Hope engenders, purpose, and vice versa. And let's hear him talk about purpose for just a moment.
The feeling of meaninglessness, or perhaps I might say one's despair over the apparent meaninglessness of life, is in no way a neurosis. You see, questing for a meaning to life, even more questioning, doubting that there is such a meaning available, is rather a human achievement than a neurotic symptom. No animal will ever raise the question whether or not its existence has a meaning, but man does, and even more, it's a privilege, it's a prerogative of youth, boldly dare and venture to challenge that there is a meaning to life rather than taking it for granted. In other words, it's an intellectual honesty and sincerity, but no neurotic disease.
I'm interested in your comments on the idea that man is not kind of controlled by drives and instincts, and maybe it would be better for him if he were. He wouldn't have the same problems, I guess.
Of course, and it's a characteristic of neurotic existence that one tries to get rid of one's freedom of choice, and one tries to just delve to intoxicate oneself by way of pleasure-seeking. Actually, basically, man is not concerned with pleasure or power. The will to power, what I'm used to calling the will to pleasure, is nothing original and primary, but rather a will to meaning, as I'm used to calling it. This means man is basically concerned with finding and fulfilling a meaning in life. And if this search for meaning is frustrated, the noogenic neurosis, the feeling of meaninglessness, results.
How would this apply, for example, to the increasing violence that we see today?
You see, when there is a feeling of meaninglessness, people do meaningless things. They resort to crime, to violence, because the will to power, exaggerated, you see, lived out, without restraint, in violence, the will to power as well as the will to pleasure are substitutes for the frustrated will to meaning. The will to meaning, one's search for meaning, is the original concern. And only a man who has been frustrated in this basic will to meaning then resorts either to power seeking or to pleasure seeking. And the crudest, most brutal form of power seeking, of living out one's search for power, is violence. And on the other hand, this pleasure seeking, the so-called pursuit of happiness, is not only contradicting one's primary will to meaning, but even more, it proves to be self-defeating. It is the very pursuit of pleasure, of happiness, that towards happiness, because happiness occurs as a byproduct, as a side effect of finding and fulfilling a meaning, or loving another being, another human being.
So, a study done with functional MRI suggests that people high in psychological well-being effectively recruit the ventral ACC, anterior cingulate cortex, when confronted with potentially aversive stimuli, manifests reduced activity in subcortical regions like the amygdala, and appraise such information as less salient as reflected in slower evaluative speed. Václav Havel, the leader of the Czech Republic at one point, said, "Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out." Snacks, coffee, glimmer of hope. Win. In summation, optimism has a stronger influence on the use of positive reappraisal as a coping strategy than does hope. But hope has a stronger influence on levels of general self-efficacy than does optimism. Hope focuses more directly on the personal attainment of specific goals and purpose, but optimism focuses more broadly on the expected quality of future outcomes in general. So, the final few slides here. In getting over this mountain, we have a couple of pieces of research showing that what you need to do to find resilience. Hagelin's, this first piece of research done last year out of Utrecht University in The Lancet has these main points. Remain as active as is reasonably possible. Acknowledge and express emotions in a way that allows you to take control of your life. Engage in self-management and try to focus on potential positive outcomes of illness. Hagelin's guide is this. There are these steps, these 10 steps. Optimism, we've gone over, repeatedly correlated with psychological well-being and health. Humor seems to have some activation in subcortical regions critical to the dopamine reward system, but pulls in all sorts of different parts of the brain, not just one. An active coping style, acknowledging and accepting problems, facing your fears, seeking social support, adapting an optimistic outlook, reframing stressors to a positive light, and exercising. It prevents dysregulation of the serotonergic neurons in the dorsiraphe nucleus. Face fears. Resilient individuals more adept at managing their fear. It shapes the neural circuits that underlie fear conditioning. Cognitive and emotional insight and flexibility, and accurate identification and hope. By transforming adverse experiences into positive learning through the critical use of meaning and purpose. Moral compass. Resilient individuals have a framework of belief that few things can shatter, adherence to some spiritual system, and an altruistic outlook towards others. And it seems that spiritual or self-transcendent experience are associated with particular neurophysiological connections. The density of 5-HT1A receptors in the dorsiraphe, hippocampus, and neocortex in particular. Morality seems to have some neural basis intrinsic to human nature. We know that acquired sociopathy has been shown to occur with damage to the anterior prefrontal cortex and anterior temporal lobes in some people. Social support, significant better outcome in a wide variety of stressors and illness. Dr. Weiss in our department is doing this great research on oxytocin. We know through the research oxytocin is important for social attachment and bonding and augments anxiolytic effects of social support and stress. Observing a resilient individual, clinician, may trigger von Economo neurons or minor neurons and learning through imitation as our patients watch us. Physical exercise attenuates the HB axis, increases release of endorphins and tryptophan, hippocampal BDNF and other genes related to neuroplasticity, as we saw. DHEA is down in the elderly and cortisol not in finding that exercise enhances immunity and wound healing in people who exercise. Balance. Resilient individuals are willing to show determination and fortitude when it's called for and let go when they need to. It provides homeostasis of physiological mechanisms mimicking the cognitive behavioral approach that simulates negative feedback loops. And finally, health-promoting choices. Resilient individuals attend more to the physical, emotional, and spiritual health of themselves and their intimate others than non-resilient individuals. They identify and express their feelings more readily and authentically. They choose healthier diets and lifestyles and connect more outside of themselves with purpose and meaning. So here are the steps up the mountain, as Hagelin has demonstrated. And hopefully, in learning resilience, whether you have that genetic profile or not, you can make it over the top. So that's it. Thank you very much for your patience. And I'm happy for anybody who wants to stay around for any questions or thoughts. Okay, thank you, and happy finding resilience.